Okay, so the comment says this: evidence for a resurrection would need to be more than supposed eyewitness of several people thousands of years ago. The reason being is that when you lower the bar that far, you now have to accept that all other supernatural claims are also accurate based on, quote, eyewitness testimony. People claim to have witnessed Vishnu, yet there are no Christian believers in Vishnu or the possibility of Hinduism being true. So it's sort of an attack on the idea of eyewitness, but then there's the sort of the, what about all the other claimants of various things throughout history? So what do we think about this?
I think there's a lot more bound up with the facts surrounding Jesus than kind of even an appearance of Vishnu. Well, people say, well, yeah, there's an Elvis sighting or a JFK sighting. Well, I mean, it's interesting, but it's not as though Elvis or JFK makes any sort of demand on me. And of course, what is the context to even make sense of the appearance of JFK or Elvis? There's no theological backdrop here, no, quote, religious backdrop to make sense of this. So it's kind of, a blip on the screen. But Jesus says, I am going to be crucified. I'm going to rise again. Here he is predicting this his own self. There is a context. And Jesus, in his whole life and teaching, is actually telling us that there is a meaning to this. It's not just this historical blip on the screen that's just, oh, that's weird. No, this is something that is the turning point of history, that Jesus' death is bringing about a new creation, ushering in a new age. He is saying that if I rise from the dead, you will know that I am a special, I'm the divine agent in the world, bringing in the kingdom. That is huge. This is a big difference. So those are some kind of backdrop issues that need to be brought to the fore. And also we can say, okay, well, what about somebody says, I can't, like Matt Dillahunty saying, I'm not a historian, I can't make any judgments. Well, this person who's raising the question say, well, you're dealing with several eyewitnesses a couple of thousand years ago, but I want something more. Basically, I'd say do the sort of thing that historians basically do. What do historians generally say? So Matt Dillahunty say he's not a historian, but people like Gary Habermas and Mike Licona, they will talk about how the majority of historians, PhDs in the relevant field of history, they are actually agreed, whether you're Jewish, Christian, agnostic, atheist, there, 75, 80, even 90% holding to certain things like Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate, that the story of the empty tomb was basically agreed upon by both friend and foe, as we see in Matthew 28. We see that the disciples were transformed, that this was, again, another historical fact that historians take for granted, the majority of them, that the disciples believed that they had been appeared to by Jesus, including his women followers, again, who were not considered credible witnesses in a first century setting. But yet here Jesus is appearing to them. And so we have eyewitnesses, we have these appearances that, again, historians generally agree to. And they also generally agree, I mean, not with as high a percentage, like the conversion of James, the brother of Jesus, becoming a follower of Christ. So we see him in Acts chapter 1 in the upper room with the other disciples. We also see Paul's conversion. Again, he himself writes about this in his own letters. So, in Galatians and 1 Corinthians, no critic questions that Paul wrote these things, but we see evidence for the resurrection in both Galatians and in 1 Corinthians. So the question is, what's going on here? So these are authentically Pauline epistles, but yet he's talking about the resurrection. He's talking about meeting with the disciples in Jerusalem. He's talking about the eyewitnesses. Where did all that stuff come from? And he's writing to people who could contradict him very readily. So we see that there is a lot of good historical work here, and the sorts of things that historians do they recognize these facts. Now, those facts by themselves don't presuppose that God raised Jesus from the dead, but the question is, when you put them all together, what makes the best sense of all of those facts that the majority of historians accept and take for granted? Well, if you say, "Oh, that didn't really happen," Jesus' disciples didn't really see him; they just had hallucinations of him. Well, it's interesting, but you still have to account for the empty tomb. How is the tomb emptied? That's very relevant. So, which hypothesis is going to make sense of all of these facts that historians take for granted? So, these historians are not necessarily saying that Jesus rose from the dead. I mean, obviously, atheists aren't, but they accept basic facts that when you put them all together, the one hypothesis that brings them all together is that God raised Jesus from the dead, not that the disciples went to the wrong tomb, that the women, were mistaken and they went to the wrong tomb, or somebody stole the disciples stole the body, or that they were hallucinating. So you can see that it's not we're not dealing with a quote supernatural fact here. These are basic historical facts accepted by historians. And the question then is, what interpretation will we give to those facts accepted by historians? Is it going to be a naturalistic one, like the women went to the wrong tomb? Or is it going to be something supernatural, like God raised Jesus from the dead? And when we look at the bigger picture, we say it actually fits much more coherently with the thesis that God raised Jesus from the dead than any other naturalistic alternative.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that way of framing it, because it exposes that when many people do face this question, they begin with a presumption that there cannot be a supernatural explanation because they do not believe in the supernatural. So rather than just looking at it and saying what might explain it, one hypothesis that 2 billion people are saying is that he rose from the dead, and then another is that let's string together various alternative explanations, but I have seen so many times a fairly resolute conviction before looking at the evidence that there cannot be a supernatural explanation that makes sense of the historical account. And when you begin that way, rather than beginning open-mindedly, I don't think that you're ever going to really, and I see this also happen where a credible source turns into a non-credible source as they go from not believing in Jesus to believing in Jesus. So Saul of Tarsus, the persecutor of Christians, great, seems like a reasonable enough guy. He's got his footing pretty good. All of a sudden, he is converted. He meets Christ in his resurrection on the road to Damascus, is radically transformed. Now is the guy proclaiming Christ is risen, guys. I got it wrong. I was killing Christians and now I'm ready to die for this. Could it be more dramatic? But from the eye of the skeptic, he's now author of the Bible. That's religious stuff. He's no longer a credible historical source. So it is again sort of what I see as a heads you win, tails I lose scenario, where when you categorize people who do believe in the resurrection as incredible historical sources, even though they're writing in history, even though you can actually verify what they've said, because they believe they're not credible, isn't that putting the cart before the horse academically?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you're making a good point that all of a sudden there is this skeptical shift. Saul, his Hebrew name, and that he's as he's persecuting Christians, that's the more reasonable approach. But when he gets in that Jesus resurrection stuff, he's really he's gone crazy. He's something weird happened to him, and so he has been thinking rightly since. But to add to this, I mean, you talked about the expectation of the miraculous. I mean, David Hume basically defined a miracle as something that cannot, fundamentally cannot happen because it violates natural laws. So, and that can't happen. So there can't be miracles. But think about this. If the very first miracle took place at the Big Bang, something coming to existence without any prior matter, energy, space, physical time.
Or the singularity. If someone's going to say the singularity preceded the Big Bang, fine. Then the singularity being the first, whatever the thing was that created the whatever we're calling nothing now in quantum physics, that is not really nothing, but whenever literally nothing became something. Sorry,
Yeah, exactly. I mean, fundamentally, the universe cannot be eternal. It's finite. It is winding down. Second law of thermodynamics, and a number of other pointers to that. But the universe has not always been here. The question is, how did it get here? And as we talk about the universe beginning to exist a finite time ago, we have some sort of a source outside or independent of the universe that brought it into being. A big bang needs a big banger, and the material world that has been wound up and is now winding down. There has to be some source of that winding up. So we basically, with the beginning of the universe, we have our first miracle. So if you can get a universe, an amazing, spectacular universe that brings about life, that sustains life, and so forth. What's a resurrection? That's no problem at all. So you've got the Big Bang, you've got kind of a Big Bang in the first century of in Jerusalem, which brings about a new era, which brings about which is an indication of God stepping into the world and doing something significant, bringing about a revolution, bringing about a dramatic new order of things. You have these two pivotal events, and both of them require a supernatural explanation. And if you have this Big Bang, you have something coming out of nothing nothing existing prior to it, then you've got your first miracle. And so you've got an explanatory context for that second one. So that's also another way of looking at it.